everyone, Helen here. I hope you're okay, and thank you for coming along to join me today. If you're here for the very first time, then sometimes I am chatting to you from the campervan. This campervan belongs to my husband Phil and I, and sometimes I'm in my craft room, more often than not really, I suppose. But today I'm in the campervan, and that's because I'm going to tell you about the second half of our most recent campervan trip to the Scottish borders. And yeah, I had so much to tell you from just the first day that I decided to split it into two, although this one will be a little bit shorter. We've got the added atmosphere today of the rain pattering down on the roof. I don't know how long that's going to continue for. We've had a lot of rain recently. And how well the camera will pick that up, I don't know, but hopefully it'll not get too loud. That's the main thing. Without further ado, I'll just get on with telling you about the trip, and I'll just begin by doing a brief resume of what we got up to last time. And we travelled from our home in Durham to Melrose in the Scottish borders, and we stayed overnight not far from Melrose with a beautiful view of the Eildon Hills, and then we spent most of the next day at Traquair House near Innerleithen. And when I left you last time, we were just leaving Traquair House. It wasn't much before closing time when we set off. We really did have a full day there, and we'd had a really lovely day out. We drove off and we found somewhere just to park and rest for a while, and I had a lovely bit of knitting time, working on the orangutan from the Moosh and Friends book by Cynthia Valley. We didn't have to travel far to get to our overnight spot, which was a woodland car park just outside Innerleithen, so it wasn't far actually from where we'd spent the day. It was a really lovely spot, and we had the quiet company of 3 other campervans for the night. For our evening meal, we had a delicious chicken curry that we'd bought from a farm shop along the way, and we accompanied it with pieces of focaccia bread and instead of the usual naan bread, because the farm shop didn't sell naan bread. I was very pleased that it was nice and colourful, because if you've watched campervan videos before, you'll know that I thought, sometimes the food looks a bit colourless. And it was very tasty too. We woke the next morning to dull skies, but no rain. The sun struggled to appear, but it did remain dry for most of the day, and we definitely didn't complain. Once we'd breakfasted, we drove in a roughly southerly direction towards the Yarrow Valley, where we'd been once before, and I've shown you a drive through there in one of my podcasts, but we hadn't had time to stop the last time. So we had a very pleasant drive, although it would have been nicer in the sunshine. But whatever the weather, it was just great to be in such lovely surroundings and just enjoy being out on the open road. We soon arrived at a loch. Well, 2 lochs in fact, although originally they were all one loch until the movement of water and earth and stones over many years split the loch into 2, and they're just joined by a little river. We parked by the Loch of the Lochs, which soon became very busy with people enjoying the water. There were swimmers and canoers and paddleboarders. Up on the hillside above the loch, we spotted a statue. So that was the first thing we wanted to investigate. It turned out to be a statue of a Scottish writer named James Hogg, who lived at around the same time as Sir Walter Scott. He was born in a nearby valley, the Ettrick Valley, and he was a shepherd. But when he started a new shepherding job at the age of 15, his employer, who had a fine library in his house, gave him free access to anything that he wanted to read, and James then developed a great love of literature and a desire to write. The verses around the base of the statue say a bit more about him. Instead of arms or golden crest, his harp with mimic flowers was dressed. Around in graceful streamers fell the briar rose and the heather bell. And I think that's just saying that his greatest love was to be out in nature. Oft had he viewed as morning rose the bosom of the lonely lows. Oft thrilled his heart at close of even to see the dappled vales of heaven, with many a mountain, moor and tree asleep upon St. Mary. And the Lows refers to the smaller of the two lochs, and St. Mary to the larger one. At evening fall in lonesome dale, he kept strange converse with the gale, held worldly pomp in high derision, and wandered in a world of vision. And this refers partly to the fact that James didn't fare well when Walter Scott introduced him to polite society in Edinburgh. He was always a rough shepherd at heart. And in fact, when James Hogg died, William Wordsworth wrote a poem about him. The mighty minstrel breathes no longer, mid mouldering ruins low he lies, and death upon the braes of Yarrow had closed the shepherd poet's eyes. However, Wordsworth also commented that Hogg was undoubtedly a man of original genius, but of coarse manners and low and offensive opinions. However, the local people were obviously very proud of him, because a crowd of about 2,000 people turned up for the unveiling of the statue, which was put up about 25 years after the poet's death. We walked back down to the shore of the smaller of the two lochs, the Loch of the Lows, and we spent some time taking photos. Although it wasn't sunny, there were still some nice reflections in the loch, and it was just a nice quiet place to poodle about for a while. After that, we decided to go for a walk along the banks of St. Mary's Loch, which is actually the largest natural loch in the Scottish borders, and it's possible to walk all the way round it, although we decided not to walk that far on this occasion. We passed Tibby Shields Inn, a place where local writers such as James Hogg would meet up, where they were kept a close eye on by the owner Tibby, who was apparently quite a character. We were heading as far as the small section of woodland known as Marchwood, another remnant of the vast Ettrick forest. We'd visited another surviving remnant of the forest on the previous day at Ettrick House. The Ettrick forest is included in one of the earliest maps of Scotland, and it saw many royal hunting parties, as well as serving as a great hiding place for Scottish soldiers such as William Wallace and his men in the 13th century. Marchwood is now a community woodland, a place for people to gather and gain the benefits of being amongst trees. And I was very happy to come across this familiar quote by John Muir carved into one of the stones. In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. at the van, it was time for some lunch. Nothing complicated, just bread and some Northumberland Reedsdale cheese made from ewe's milk. It was really nice. And some broccoli crisps, though they weren't as tasty as I'd hoped. And we followed that by a piece of ginger cake that we'd bought. We then drove back along the shores of St Mary's Loch, out of the Yarrow Valley and into the adjacent Ettrick Valley, which is actually quite different in character to the Yarrow. We were hoping to go to an exhibition about the writer James Hogg being held in the village where he was born, but we found that it wasn't open on the day that we were there, so we had to be content with visiting the memorial that marks the location of Ettrick House Farm Cottage, where James Hogg was born. We then headed along the Ettrick Valley towards Selkirk. We arrived in the small town of Selkirk at the end of the afternoon, and the place was very quiet, practically deserted, with many shops closed and also the museum closed. Selkirk was once at the centre of the Border's spinning and weaving industry, and there are still textiles produced in Selkirk today, and it was also famous for making shoes. I read a story that said that Bonnie Prince Charlie had paused in Selkirk on his march towards London and asked for 2,000 pairs of shoes to be made for his army. And then he left without paying for them, apparently. The writer Sir Walter Scott was closely associated with the town, and he served as High Sheriff for over 30 years, overseeing all the court cases. It was a pity that the local history museum had already closed, but instead we headed up to the old churchyard. The ruins of the old kirk, which was in use between 1747 and 1861, are actually on the site of an earlier 12th century church, the Kirk of the Forest, and it's thought that it was here that the great Scottish hero William Wallace was officially appointed as Guardian of Scotland. In fact, the name Selkirk actually means church or kirk in the forest, the forest being the great Ettrick Forest that I've already mentioned a couple of times. Another interesting thing that we learned at this place was that it has a connection with Franklin D. Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States of America. His direct descendants, the Murrays, were from the Selkirk area, and it was Franklin's great-great-great-grandfather, a Scottish merchant called James Murray, who emigrated to North Carolina in 1765. There's a whole aisle of the old kirk dedicated to these ancestors, and we spent a while there reading all the names of the families of the past who would never know of their connection with an American president. And yeah, that's where I'm going to leave it for today. We did go home after that, after we'd visited Selkirk. Well, actually we stopped off for a pub meal, a really nice meal at a pub called the Horses and Hounds in a little place called Bonchester Bridge. It was really nice. And then we just headed back home. We got home quite late in the evening. But yeah, So that's another very little campervan trip, but I seem to have managed to stretch it into 2 parts. But there'll be more campervan adventures coming along very soon, and although before we go off in the campervan again, I've got a little holiday away in Northumberland with my mum, so that should be nice, and I'm sure I'll have things to tell you about that as well, and I'll be updating you with my crafty projects and things. So yes, plenty more for me to share with you in my upcoming podcasts. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed, if you watch and you haven't subscribed, it is okay. I know I've watched 1 or 2 YouTube videos where they tell people it's free to subscribe, and that kind of raised thought in my mind that maybe there are some people who think that subscribing means you have to pay or something, but you don't. It's all free. And if you've already subscribed, maybe you might like to give my video a like. I don't often remind anybody to do these things, but just from time to time I think, oh well, I'll just remind you in case you want to do those things. Right then, now I'm going to stop rattling on now, and I will look forward to seeing you before very long. So until then, take good care of yourself, keep yourself nice and busy, and I will be back soon. Okay then, bye.